So one, a secular hurrah to celebrate James Madison's 250th birthday. The Liberty of Congress hosted a symposium attended by the country's most distinguished Madison scholars. The probing of Madison's religious views played a significant role. Afterward, one noted scholar told me that since he was himself a secular man, quote, the more secular Madison's position turns out, the more I cheer, end quote. For him, I suppose, quote unquote, secular means good, progressive, forward-thinking, or forward-looking. So yes, the fitting response is hurrah. Quote unquote, religion may be linked to intolerant, divisive, backward, dying, passé. That suggests at least a quiet boo. In this vein, the concentration of historians and political theorists, or at least the religious of the founders, makes perfect sense. Why highlight what is at least relevant to the future? The three figures of the founding eras most studied nowadays are the figures regarded as the least religious: Jefferson, Madison, and Franklin. There is such a concentration is not in dispute. It characterizes some Straussians on the right as well as mainline academics on the left. By contrast, Madison's two companions in writing, the Federalists, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, are relatively little studied. Even though John Adams was the man most admired of the age as the father of independence, the preeminent parliamentarian, and the leading jurist of constitutional law and history, he has today been almost forgotten. About John Dickens, George Mason, Benjamin Rush, James Wilson, Sam Adams, John Witherspoon, and other first-class minds, we have been taught very little. For most of these important leaders, worthy biographies are not available, and their writings are go relatively unstudied. Sherman, Williams, Williamson, R.T. Payne, Paca, and Morris. Virtually all the signers of the Declaration and Constitution were church-going men. Several were ministers and chaplains. Others had trained to become ministers, and still others conspicuously learned in religion. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration, 34 were Anglican, 13 Congregationalists, once known as Puritans, 6 Presbyterian, and one each Baptist, Catholic, and Quaker. Their proportions regarding the Constitution were nearly the same. A man who had roomed with Alexander Hamilton wrote of having admired the latter's habit of dropping to his knees to pray before retiring, and the seriousness of his religious reading and his replies to objections to his faith. The son of Jonathan Edwards, also a distinguished clergyman, wrote of Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who was an active participant in two congregations, that he, quote, he could, with reputation to himself and improvement to others, converse on the most important subjects of theology. I confess myself to have been often entertained, and in the general course of my long and intimate acquaintance with him, to have been much improved by his observations on the principal subjects of doctrinal and practical divinity, end quote. William Williams of Connecticut entered Harvard at 16 and after graduation devoted himself to the study of theology for several years. Hugh Williamson of North Carolina studied medicine at Edinburgh, London, and Utrecht before becoming a licensed Presbyterian preacher, but was never ordained. Robert Treat Paine served as a chaplain to the troops of Massachusetts Bay. William Paca of Maryland, having become governor after the war, addressed the Maryland Assembly with these words, quote, the sufferings of the ministers of the gospel of all denominations during the war have been very considerable, and the perseverance and firmness of those who discharge their sacred functions under many discouraging circumstances claim our acknowledgments and thanks, end quote. As happened in many states, the legislature made financial provision for the support of the several denominations in Maryland. The legislators of Maryland, like the governor, were, quote, thoroughly convinced of the powerful influence of religion, end quote, upon, quote, the happiness and welfare of our people, end quote. Throughout the new states, the opinion was universal, save only in the case of Madison, that religion added to the resource available, and to reason, powerful new motives for learning, good moral habits, and for this important reason, among others, religion had indispensable civic utility. This utility did not detract from the transcendent good of religion in and of itself, but it did offer practical reasons why governments should not be careless in its assistance. Thus, Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, who spoke more frequently, 173 times, than anyone else at the Constitutional Convention, especially on the subject of untrustworthiness of human reason and morals, voiced the most common sentiment of all the founders when he wrote in his quote, notes on the form of a constitution for France, end quote, says, quote, religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Uh, Therefore, education should teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man towards God, but each one has a right to entire liberty as to religious opinions, for religion is the relation between God and man, therefore it is not within the reach of human authority, end quote. Morris, Morris's two almost universally shared principles that religious liberty is equally a natural right of every man, given the sacredness of the creature's duties to his creator, and that neither human nature nor reason alone is a defendable support for moral life in a republic, are the distinctive marks of the American mind in the founding period. The first principle went beyond Locke in its grounding for natural rights, and that second marked a distinct chasm between American realism and the quote-unquote idle theories of human perfectibility then sweeping Europe. Alexander Hamilton. With a realism equal to that of Morris, Alexander Hamilton once wrote in a letter, says, quote, nothing is more fallacious than to expect to produce any valuable or permanent results in political projects by relying merely on the reason of men. Men are rather reasoning than reasonable animals, for the most part governed by the impulse of passion, end quote. He had written in the same vein in the Federalist number 15, and states, there was a time when we were told that breaches by the states of the regulations of the federal authority were not to be expected, that a sense of common interest would preside over the conduct of the respective members, and would eager a full compliance with all the constitutional requisitions of the Union. This language, as the present day, would appear as wild as a great part of what we now hear from the same quarter will be thought, when we shall have received further lessons from the best oracle of wisdom experience. It at all times betrayed an ignorance of the true springs by which human conduct is actuated, and belied the original inducements to the establishment of civil power. Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Has it been found that bodies of men act with more rectitude or greater disinterestedness than individuals? The contrary of this has been inferred by all accurate observers of the conduct of mankind, and the inference is founded upon obvious reasons. Regard the reputation has a less active influence when the infamy of a bad action is to be divided among a number than when it is to fall singly upon one. A spirit of faction, which is apt to mingle its poison in the deliberations of all bodies of men, will often hurry the persons of whom they composed into improprieties and excesses for which they would blush in a private capacity. On the other side of man's nature, however, Hamilton saw brilliant light. Quote, the sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. End quote. It is not to be forgotten that Hamilton, who had served with Washington as an artillery commander since the tender age of 19, also drafted President Washington's classic and justly famous quote-unquote farewell address, the farewell address, with its eloquent recognitions both of the noble and ignoble sides of human nature. I recall being stunned when I first read of Alexander Hamilton's tender request that the Holy Eucharist might be brought to him on his deathbed. I had heard much of his hard-headedness. I had not heard of his piety. At an early age Hamilton lay dying from the festering wound, Suffering in his one-sided duel with Aaron Burr, and Bishop Moore at first refused his request for the sacrament, lest the solemnity of the Eucharist be diminished by the scandal of dueling. On the second day, moved by Hamilton's humble pleading and tender piety, the bishop brought the Eucharist, much to Hamilton's joy. Nothing in the standard portraits of Hamilton had prepared me for this scene. I had not encountered either the tenderness of the religious convictions expressed in the last of his letters. It states, "This letter, my dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career to begin, as I humbly hope, from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. I need not tell you of the pangs I felt from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on the topic, lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives, best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me." Princeton's John Witherspoon. Still another figure loomed larger in my imagination once I began reading widely about the religious views of our forgotten founders. In 1768, after much pleading by separate delegations of distinguished Americans, the Reverend John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian professor of religion in Glasgow, at least agreed to come to America to accept the presidency of the newly founded College of New Jersey at Princeton. The Presbyterians were a dissenting church, opposed to the Anglican establishment, but there were already some 500 Presbyterian congregations around the country. The young Witherspoon was a first-class scholar, a learned and eloquent preacher, and a teacher compelling enough to induce James Madison to stay on for an extra year, to plumb the deep connections between civil and religious liberty, and to study Hebrew, the better to read the Bible. The lesson Witherspoon wanted graduates of Princeton to grasp was that all other rights spring from one source, the dignity of the free decisions each individual must make in the presence of the Creator. These decisions can be made by no one else but that individual, and in that precise sense are inalienable. Made in God's presence, they are sacred because they are linked to all other decisions. They are also full of implications for civil society. With Witherspoon's grasp of both biblical history and church history was so firm that he could illustrate this connection, age after age, in context after the context, until the young Madison could grasp the historical power of the proposition as well as the philosophical. It was a matter of principle to Witherspoon not to speak of politics in his sermons. He had few beliefs deeper than that church should not mix in state matters, nor state in church, lest the two liberties, civil and religious, do harm to one another. His greatest jealousy was on the side of divinity. He wished to preserve the purity and integrity of the gospel. When a devout Christian meets his duty in civil society, he should do so with honor, integrity, and jealousy for the purity of religion. On his arrival in America, Witherspoon scoffed at idle talk about independence and rebellion. He cherished the British traditions of rights and liberties. Gradually, however, particularly after the misbegotten interventions of the king in Massachusetts in 1774, Witherspoon came to judge that the king was too far from America to grasp its reality, and by wrong, destructive misjudgments was undercutting his legitimacy as a just ruler. Inexorably, Witherspoon was drawn towards the cause of independence. With much trepidation but firm resolve, he was finally moved to preach publicly on the subject in May of 1776, choosing it as his theme, how Providence acts in the affairs of men, often taking away the strength of the powerful, and instructing the weak in the necessity of uncommon virtue and brotherly unity. The powerful are often brought down by their own actions, and the weak raised up beyond their deserts. He cited instances from the history of the first Israel. It was common to think of America as the second. As we have noticed in chapter 2 above, there has rarely been a more influential professor in American history Besides being the teacher of one President Madison, B.A. 1771, and one Vice President Burr, B.A. 1772, Witherspoon was a delegate Congress, Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a member of 3 standing committees during the Revolutionary War, and of more than 120 congressional committees. He was often chosen by his colleagues to be the draftsman of important congressional decrees. After the war, Witherspoon later became an active champion of New Jersey's ratification of the federal Constitution. Witherspoon's learning, his authority, and his bearings brought the Congress weightiness, sobriety, wisdom, and courage. He was a tower of strength to his younger colleagues. In paintings and stained glass windows of the early founders, his is a distinctive presence. No university president since, not even Wilson at Princeton or Eisenhower at Columbia, has played so great a role in shaping this nation's character. Here's Livingston, King, and Henry. Some of the signers were troubled in their Anglicanism because of its persecution of dissidents such as the Baptists of Virginia, or because of its ties to England in a time of independence, or because of its establishment or its too Catholic liturgy. On the other side, the stricter forms of Calvinism created intellectual crisis for several of the signers, in some cases because of too severe a castigation of the powers of reason, in other cases because of the too inflexible and forbidding a notion of predestination, in still others cases because of too severely literal a reading of Scripture, or too constrained an insistence on quote-unquote Scripture alone. Serious study and intelligent discussions of religious matters among intelligent laymen was far more common in those days than in ours. Thus, for instance, William Livingston of New Jersey, in whose home Alexander Hamilton lived for some time as a youth, made a name for himself among Calvinists by correcting those among his followers who interpreted predestination to imply dependence on, quote, a superior and irresistible agency, end quote, which reduced them to, quote, mere machines, void of intelligence and free volition, end quote. He insisted that Calvinists must be governors of their own lives, take hold of their capacities for moral direction, positively choosing against evil and for good. His influence on behalf of a robust activism was quite marked. A member of the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration, he took command of the New Jersey militia in 1776, and then was elected governor of the new state, in which capacity he served until his death in 1790. Rufus King of New York was one of those who left the Congregational Church for the Anglican, becoming warden of at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, right in the teeth of the war in 1782. Like the others, he thought religion, the foundation of social stability, essential to strengthening moral conduct throughout the society, and a source of personal strength and adversity. In adversity, his reputation as an active Christian layman was such that he was asked to join the board of the American Bible Society. He strongly approved of its work, but declined at that time. After nasty public attacks on his character, Patrick Henry once wrote his daughter as follows. It says, amongst other strange things said of me, I hear it is said that by the deists that I am one of their number, and indeed that some good people think I am no Christian. This thought gives me much more pain than the appellation of Tory, because I think religion of infinitely higher importance than politics. And I find much cause to reproach myself that I have lived so long and have given no decided and public proofs of my being a Christian. But indeed, my dear child, this is a character which I prize for far above all this world has or can boast. Rush, Dickens, and Wilson. 3 overlooked stars from Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania are John Dickinson, Benjamin Rush, and James Wilson. John Dickinson was an avid reader in history and law. His commonplace books show a wide-ranging mind, devouring authors from Tacitus to Blackstone. In the midst of eminent colleagues, he dared to write, not without reason, that he had, quote, acquired a greater knowledge in history and the laws and constitution of my country than generally attained by men in my class, end quote. Worried by encroachments of British arrogance in the colonies, he became an outspoken champion of freedom. He even composed a drinking ballad whose rousing chorus went as follows. It says, "In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our right arms are ready. Steady, men, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men. Our lives we will give." I wanted to skip over to Thomas Paine. Yet it was not only Catholics or devout Anglicans who saw the source of rights of consciousness in God. This was true also of those few, like Thomas Paine, who rejected the Bible and the common doctrines of Christianity, and was therefore often called an atheist, but who believed devoutly in God, and even in some form of eternal punishment or reward. So strongly did Paine believe that he rushed to France after 1789, where, appalled by the rivers of blood flowing from the guillotine and at the cost of being sent to prison himself, he campaigned rigorously against atheism. Paine could not see how one could deny the existence of God without taking away the foundation of human rights, and the libertinism with which the atheistic Jacobins violated the most basic rights of tens of thousands of their victims. He saw proof of the connection between atheism and the disappearance of rights. This is, quote, "In my publications on religious subjects," quote, end quote, Paine wrote some years after the prison term in France, during which he completed the Age of Reason. It says, quote, "My endeavors have been directed to bring man to a right use of the reason that God has given him, to impress on him the great principles of divine morality, justice, and mercy, and a benevolent disposition to all men and to all creatures, and to inspire in him a spirit of trust, confidence, and consolation in his Creator, unshackled by the fables of books pretending to be the Word of God." End quote. From this passage, one can see, in retrospect, how much of Judaism and Christianity lingers in Paine's theophilanthropy, as he called his new credo his, quote, "love of God and man," end quote. The Age of Reason was denounced by Orthodox Protestant preachers in America because of its renunciation of the Bible, but Catholics, although dismayed by its simplistic attacks on biblical literalism, found in it a familiar, if flawed, attempt at quote-unquote natural theology, that is, that part of knowledge of God which can be discovered through reason alone, a branch of philosophy dear to many Jesuits of that era. Deist societies throughout America distributed Paine's manifesto broadly and with enthusiasm. This is, quote, "I believe in one God and no more," end quote. Paine wrote smartly at the beginning of the Age of Reason, quote, "And I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy," end quote. Then lest one begin to think that Paine is really still a Protestant Christian, as those words about justice and mercy and fellow feeling suggest, he immediately clarifies, quote, "I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, by the Roman Church, by the Greek Church, by the Turkish Church, by the Protestant Church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church," end quote. Some years later, Paine described his philosophy this way. This is, quote, "The study of natural philosophy is a divine study, because it is the study of the works of God and the creation. If we consider theology upon this ground, what an extensive field of improvement in things both divine and human opens itself before us," end quote. He goes on, quote, "All the principles of science are of divine origin. It was not man that invented the principles on which astronomy and every branch of mathematics are founded and studied," end quote. This was by 1797. Paine's battle against biblical Christians was known worldwide, but his new battle, as he told the Paris Society of Theophilanthropists, was against atheism, stating, "Religion has two principal enemies, fanaticism and infidelity, or that which is called atheism. The first requires to be combated by reason and morality, the other by natural philosophy. The existence of a God and the first dogma of the Theophilanthropists. The universe is the Bible of a true Theophilanthropist. It is there that he reads of God. It is there that the proofs of his existence are to be sought and found." In 1807, Paine published another pamphlet, in which he included a short passage entitled My Private Thoughts on a Future State, which began as follows. It says, I have said in the first part of the Age of Reason that, quote, I hope for happiness after this life, end quote. This hope is comfortable to me, and I presume not to go beyond the comfortable idea of hope with respect to a future state. I consider myself in the hands of my Creator, and that He will dispose of me after this life consistently with His justice and goodness. I leave all these matters to Him as my Creator and friend, and I hold it to be a presumption in man to make an article of faith as to what the Creator will do with us hereafter. Paine hardly seemed to be aware of how much of his new credo he owes, not to reason, but to the words of Jesus Christ. Neither the Greeks nor Romans of the ancient world knew of, quote unquote, the Creator, nor of a divine justice and mercy, nor of eternal life, nor that God called them to be His friends. Far more than he recognized, Paine relied still on the Christian metaphysics, the Christian view of the cosmos and human destiny. In real life, he certainly preferred to turn with robust hope towards assisting his fellow citizens to build up a more civilized society of reason, liberty, and rights. He knew from painful experience that the city he aspired to would be a modest city, no doubt faulty, even if true to its own best intuitions. In this vision, Paine participated willy-nilly in a Jewish and Christian hope and the friendliness of the Creator and Governor of all things, who gave human reasons and placed them in the time of suffering and trial. His own many afflictions Paine endured bravely and died in poverty and without any monument to his name. In 1809, no one can deny Paine's commitment to liberty and rights, and his consistency in throwing his own safety against abuses of rights, whether by revolutionaries or kings. Not long before his death, he had fondly quoted Pope. It says, quote, he can't be wrong whose life is in the right, end quote. Paine signed neither the Declaration or the Constitution, yet no one can deny him an important role among those who inspired the birth of this new republic. Through his eagerly read books, he awakened many to their rights. If nearly all of the other top 100 founders more expressly employed biblical words and phrases in doing so, Paine spoke most eloquently of the lift provided by the other wing of the eagle, the lift provided by reason, or, as he preferred, common sense. His is an important, if minority, voice in the American story.